Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic that we will be analyzing is looking at world history and international relations, and thereby looking at First World War. Trying to understand in the lecture that what were the causes of the First World War, what was the impact of the First World War on international relations, and most important, when we are revisiting, reaccessing the history from point of view of various events that took place, what have been the important research debates pertaining to that topic, and how these debates, these inputs, how they are essential for the present day issues, for debates on contemporary perspectives of global politics. Dear learners, in the lecture, as we analyze world history from the perspective of world international relations, we look at the dynamics of alliances, the issue of imperialism, and above all, how global politics proceeded as nations' relation became or more on the suspicious aspect, then looking at deterrence, and above all, issues of nationalism in the world history from the perspective of international relations. Dear learners, it is very essential to have this distinction here, because world history definitely has been a separate field of study in the realm of history, but it has an important bearing for the discipline of political science as well. So therefore, we will analyze the First World War as an important aspect of international relation. Dear learners, let's first understand that what was the First World War about. The First World War that began in 1914 and it ended in 1918. The First World War, which began after the assassination of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand and lasted more than 4 years. Now, what is essential to be seen here is that there have been wars in world history, but the First World War, it was a warfare that left millions of soldiers, millions of civilians dead and wounded. And this First World War presented glimpse-like trench warfare, submarines that were a unique kind of a special use of warfare in conduct of the diplomatic aspects and the warring strategies of nations. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, no doubt, has been looked upon as the primary immediate cause of the First World War. However, dear learners, it is essential that we must take into account that there were many other factors that played an important role in leading up to the First World War. And in this perspective, we must also analyze some important works that have been done to reanalyze and reaccess the causes of the First World War. Expansionism primarily was witnessed in the world scape, and here in the issue of how European nations had empires across the globe has been an important point of research and analysis. This ambit of expansionism has been also called as imperialism. Imperialism, if we are to define, it can be said it's an ideology of a country to extend its rule over another area outside its territory for its benefit. Now, British and French expansionism continued, and within this aspect of expansionism, tensions rose between opposing empires, namely herein we can say Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Some examples to prove the point: Prior to the First World War, the naval superpower of Britain, that was the largest empire in the world, and its rivals, Germany, Italy, France, which led to many diplomatic crises, and especially during the scramble for Africa. Let's have an understanding on this idea of scramble for Africa. Dear learners, in the final decades of the 19th century, if we go by accounts of several world historical documents, there are remarks that certain European countries had laid claim to most of Africa during a process of colonial expansionism. This is often referred to as the scramble for Africa. Then another important issue related to it, did it cause the war? Now, no doubt increased rivalry between European nations as they fought against each other for territory in Africa and control over different regions. It definitely led to more tensions, rise of suspicion, quest of power game, quest for competition. Related to it was the other issue of heightened sense of nationalism, wherein attitudes, beliefs held by individuals identifying with and supporting their own nations, attitude of supremacy, superiority, led to another related cause, that was militarism. And with this militarism, that one world witness was the clash of interests of the imperial powers and in Europe. Nationalism, therefore, if we go by remarks of history and works of research in this realm, points out that how nationalism created new areas of interest over which nations could compete. Dear learners, let's take an example here, the Serbian nationalism, wherein nationalism was one of the many political forces at play when we look at the Balkan area, the Slavic Serbs that sought independence from Austria. And related to it is the aspect that is how Hungary and Ottoman Empire, and in 1878 they tried to gain control of Bosnia and Herzegovina to form a united Serbian state. Related to it, again, what we see here is that the world witnessed that there was decline of the Ottoman Empire. Serbian nationalism increased. The Balkan Wars virtually, if we go by researches in history, points out how it eradicated the Ottoman presence in Europe, and this also led to violent strife. Alliances, as we all know, they are important in the field of global politics. The First World War also had this influence of alliances, and the conflict over alliances, it is argued that in the age of imperialism prior to the First World War, countries throughout Europe had created alliances. The alliances promised that each country would support the other if war broke out between an ally and another power. So what is essential to be seen here is that the kind of alliances that came up prior to the First World War. There was alliances of Russia and Serbia, France and Russia, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Britain, France, Belgium, France, Britain, Russia. So therefore there were tensions that were increasing, tensions that grew, and this led to rise of more hostility. A naval arms race between Great Britain and German Empire made the conflict of the high seas almost inevitable. Then to add to that, the German success in the Franco-German War fostered a belief in the supremacy of Prussian militarism. Germany's annexation of Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-German War. So all this were building up tensions wherein the world was put on the plane of the First World War. Similarly, when we talk about alliances, deliberating there, alliances were important feature of international system on the eve of the First World War. But why do we need alliances? Because there was a belief that the pacts resulted from the country's hope for balance of power. An important theoretical as well as factual information in this regard is the issue of Triple Alliance versus Triple Entente. The Triple Alliance had members like Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy. The opposing camp, Triple Entente, Britain, France and Russia. The argument wherein learners of global politics, international diplomacy needs to really analyze here is that was Europe in 1914, which was surrounded by an armed camp, its politics was dominated by two rival alliances. And herein the impact of the First World War, how it dominated the later research and theoretical understanding of international relations. Dear learners, we take an important book here for further analysis, David Stevenson's, that is Armaments and the Coming of War. Now this work by David Stevenson tries to re-access the war from the perspective of the alliances, the armaments, and above all that how the situation in Europe in 1914 has important messages for the contemporary global politics. The book argues that the role of the armaments policies of the then great powers was somewhere important in the breakdown of international equilibrium if we take the time stretch of 1904 to 1914. The book also has an important perspective for studies in deterrence, a perspective that is the defense policies of the powers then and the interaction between the growth of the aspect of military preparedness and its related diplomatic crisis, for example, as the world saw in the Mediterranean, the Balkans, that culminated in the events in July-August 1914. So therefore, it is essential to be seen, as Stevenson's books point out, that armaments and its related activities definitely led to breakdown of the international equilibrium. Another important work, War by Timeline by Taylor. The work gives us an important account on the history of mobilization, the maneuvers, the movement of the armies of the great powers when we look at the time framework of 1914. When the crisis of 1914 occurred, it is being argued by Taylor that none of the leaders really wanted war. But however, once again, if we go by the arguments made in the book War by Timeline, but at that time each felt that they had to mobilize faster than the others or lose out the advantage. Then in the process, there was this blaming of the victim of their own lot, and of course looking at that how logistical preparedness, the movements, the efforts to have more and more resources, armaments, Europe slid unwillingly but relentlessly into the war. Now, this War by Timeline once again has an important message and implication for contemporary global politics also, because timelines and limited resources that were meant to serve as a deterrent to war instead relentlessly drove the powers into a conflict that engulfed the world. Similarly, in international security, the discipline has an important research area for deterrence. So what you see here is that a policy of deterrence, which generally refers to the threats of military retaliation directed by the leaders of one state to the leaders of another, in an attempt to prevent the other state from resorting to the threat of use of military force in pursuit of its foreign policy goals. The debate again that that comes forward when we look at the work of Stevenson, when we have inputs from the work of Taylor, that is, in comparison with the World War era, has deterrence in international politics changed significantly? And we are confident that our learners will reflect on this very important point of debate, that is with reference to deterrence, issue of armaments, alliances in the contemporary world politics also. Then an important perspective that we get from oxfordbibliographies.com is that we take the work of Bernard Brodie, and that's the perspective that the standard realist theory of war prevention would no longer suffice, and it is essential to be revised. Therefore, it is needed to revise it in light of the new strategic realities. Dale Copeland's perspective that the First World War is probably the most analyzed and contested case in international relations world war. So therefore, what we see here is that the First World War gave us the glimpse, it gave us the study resource of how the world actually works. It gave us the experiential perspective in order to understand the work on the aspect of what should be and not what ought to be. And therefore, this brings us to the important aspect of our lecture, that is, what were then the consequences of the First World War, and once again, how these consequences had a bearing to future historical events, and also how these consequences and its messages thereof have a bearing for contemporary world politics also. See, what we see here is that the Hague conferences that were held in 1882 and 1907, they failed to emerge as an international organization. The Hague Convention, which were a series of international treaties that were issued from international conferences held at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1899 and 1907, they failed to emerge as an international organization. There was unemployment after the First World War, famine, epidemics, the fall of the Russian Empire after the October Revolution 1917, the formation of USSR 1922, wherein the 1922 treaty between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, modern-day Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Similarly, an important aspect here is that the First World War led to emergence of United States of America as a superpower. In April 1917, President Wilson stood before the Congress, and we take reference from NEH.gov resources, and how he said that the world must be made safe for democracy. And the question that were presented after the war and even relevant for today's American politics, debates on global governance, that what is America's role in the world. Japan became an important country, powerful country in Asia. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia became independent countries. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania became independent, and the rule of Ottomans comes to an end. New boundaries were drawn up, and therefore what we see here at the same time, independent movements in Asia and Africa gained momentum. The League of Nations came into being. Germany had to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. German colonies were also shared. Germany gave up the Saar coal field based on the clauses of Treaty of Versailles. The important debate here, wherein the consequences of the First World War, and of course the earlier precedent of causes of First World and its relation to global politics. We take one important work here to prove and of course analyze the point, seen Macmillan's work, that is July 1914, Countdown to War. July 1914, this work tells the story of Europe's countdown to the war, and of course there are references, researches done from the work and inputs from the people who between the 1949 to the final plunge in on 4th August. What we see here is that how the European conflict was translated into a world war, an event that was primarily about and within European vicinity was translated as a world war. So therefore, outbreak of war, as the word proves, was not any accident or not by any fate. It was individual statesmen pursuing the real objectives that conjured up the conflict. So dear learners, as we try to reflect on world history, we find that First World War has not only been an important event in the world history, but it has an important bearing on the field of global politics and international relations. It tells us that it's the state which is the most important actor in global politics. It proves the point that national interest, the need for secure borders, has always been the guiding motive for states in global diplomacy. And then how the further research on the issue of alliances, imperialism, expansionism, deterrence proves that though the content and the form of this outreach from deterrence to international alliances may have changed, but it's national interest which is the supreme guiding parameter for nations in the realm of global diplomacy. Dear learners, we hope that you gained some significant insights for the study of world history, for analysis of global diplomacy from the vantage point of First World War, and how its causes and consequences have some important messages for international relations. Thank you very much for being with us for the lecture.